1. The death decree. The king confronted with his destiny. Ezekiel had faced many challenges as the king of Judah, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The prophet Isaiah, the voice of God's will on earth, had entered his chamber with a grim message. Set your house in order, for you are going to die. You will not recover. 2 Kings 20 verse 1. Death was not an enemy he had ever expected to face so soon. The king, who had fought battles for his people, was now locked in a battle with fate itself. Could this truly be the end? The news hit him like a blow. How could his life, so intertwined with the will of God, be coming to an end now? Ezekiel had been a righteous king, doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He had restored the temple and led his people back to worship. Why would God decree his death now? His heart sank under the weight of the impending end. What would happen to Judah without him? Was his work unfinished? As Isaiah left, Ezekiel felt the walls of the room close in around him. The silence was suffocating. How does one prepare for death? The words of Isaiah echoed in his mind, a sentence handed down by none other than God himself. Could he accept this decree? His body was weak with illness, but his spirit fought against the idea of surrender. Was this truly the fate that awaited him, or could the Almighty's hand be swayed by one last plea? Ezekiel lay back, feeling the coldness of the stone beneath him. Was this how it all ended? A king who had tried to restore the land to God's favor, now abandoned to a deathbed. His mind raced with memories of his reign, the victories, the temple restoration, the prayers offered in the same sanctuary he had fought to rebuild. Hadn't he been faithful enough? Ezekiel's heart was filled with questions that only God could answer. As his thoughts spiraled, the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker. How could he die when his kingdom still needed him? Judah was surrounded by enemies, and his death would leave them vulnerable. Would God truly abandon his people by taking their king? Ezekiel's eyes filled with tears. Not for himself, but for the future of the nation he loved. His reign had brought renewal, but without him, would it all unravel? The prophet's words weighed heavily on Ezekiel's mind. Isaiah had spoken the will of God. Could God's will be changed? Ezekiel's chest tightened with fear and uncertainty. The sickness ravaging his body felt like chains pulling him toward a fate he was not ready to face. Was it too late? Was there any hope left, or had God's decision already been sealed? The room seemed to close in, and with it, his chances of survival. Ezekiel turned his face to the wall, tears welling in his eyes. His mind raced through the scriptures, the promises of God's faithfulness. Hadn't God extended mercy before? His heart clung to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, God would hear him. Desperation overtook him, and his soul cried out. Could one last prayer change the course of his fate? The king closed his eyes, his hands trembling. He knew what he had to do. 2. The internal struggle. Accept death or fight for life? Alone in the stillness of his chamber, Ezekiel's mind wrestled with the impossible choice. Should he accept God's decree, or should he fight it? The fear of death gripped him like a vice, and yet there was a voice within that whispered of hope. Hadn't God shown mercy to his people before? The king had witnessed miracles in his life, seen God's hand move in the impossible. But could God truly be persuaded to reverse a judgment of death? The conflict within Ezekiel grew. How does a man confront his mortality? He was a king, a leader chosen by God, but now he faced the same end that came for all men. His illness weighed him down. Each breath labored, each heartbeat a reminder that time was slipping away. Was it selfish to ask for more time? The thought gnawed at him, but deep within, he knew that his kingdom still needed him. How could he leave his people now? Ezekiel's faith had always been his anchor, the guiding light of his reign. But now, in the face of death, that faith felt fragile. Could he trust in God's will, even when it seemed cruel? The temptation to resign, to simply accept the inevitable, tugged at him. But every fiber of his being rebelled against it. What if God was waiting for him to ask, waiting for him to show his faith one last time? His mind flashed to the great men of faith who had come before him. Had not Abraham questioned God's plans for Sodom? Had Moses not pleaded for the people of Israel when they sinned? God had listened then. Would he listen now? Ezekiel's heart pounded as these thoughts stirred his spirit. Was this a test of his faith, or a final decree from which there was no escape? The line between the two blurred in his mind. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He was not just a king, he was a shepherd to God's people. Was his mission truly over? Judah still needed leadership, still needed stability. Could he abandon them now, knowing the enemies that surrounded them? His heart ached at the thought of leaving his people vulnerable. Perhaps his purpose had not yet been fulfilled. Perhaps there was still work to be done. The room was silent, save for the sound of Ezekiel's labored breathing. How could a king, a man of faith, reconcile with death? Was this God's punishment for some unseen sin, or was this simply the end? Had he served faithfully enough to ask for more time? The questions burned in his heart, each one more painful than the last. He knew he needed to make a decision. Would he surrender to death, or fight for his life in the only way he knew, through prayer? Finally, Ezekiel's heart settled on a truth he had known all along. God is merciful. The God he served was a God of compassion, a God who hears the cries of his people. Could he not cry out now, in his moment of greatest need? The internal struggle faded as a new resolve took its place. Ezekiel knew what he had to do. He would pray. He would plead with the God of Israel for more time. With trembling hands and a heart full of hope, Ezekiel turned his face to the wall once more. Could a king's prayer truly change the will of God? He didn't know, but he had to try. His life, his kingdom, and his legacy hung in the balance. And so, with every ounce of strength left in him, Ezekiel began to pray. 3. The desperate prayer, a cry for life. Ezekiel's prayer was not one of eloquent words or royal proclamations. It was raw, desperate, and filled with the vulnerability of a man facing the end. Could God hear him now, in his weakest moment? His face pressed against the cold stone wall, tears streaming down his cheeks. His voice trembled as he cried out, "Remember, O Lord, how I have walked before you faithfully and with wholehearted devotion, and have done what is good in your eyes." 2 Kings 20 verse 3. His words echoed in the silent room, a plea to the only one who could change the decree that had been given. Would God remember? Ezekiel's heart ached as he reflected on his life, the years spent restoring Judah's faith, the battles fought in God's name. He had led with integrity, but had it been enough? Could he truly ask for more time when others had gone before him without such mercy? His chest tightened with the weight of his own doubt. Tears flowed freely as Ezekiel continued his prayer. He did not try to hide his fear, nor did he mask his desperation. Was it wrong to be afraid? In this moment, he was not a king but a man begging for his life. His voice faltered as he whispered his deepest fear. Will I die without seeing my purpose fulfilled? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Could God extend his life, or was this his final moment? With each word, Ezekiel felt his heart break open. His illness had weakened his body, but his spirit surged with a final hope. Could one prayer change everything? He remembered the stories of old, of men and women whose prayers had reached God's ears and moved him to act. Would his prayer be among them? The silence that followed was deafening, as though the entire universe held its breath, waiting for God's response. Ezekiel's thoughts turned to the people of Judah. How could they survive without him? The enemies that surrounded them were ruthless, and the kingdom was still fragile from the reforms he had implemented. Who would lead them if he were gone? His heart ached for his people, for the kingdom he had fought to protect. Could God take him now, when there was still so much to do? The prayer became a plea for his people as much as for himself. In the quiet that followed, Ezekiel felt a strange calm wash over him. Was this the peace that comes before death? Or was it something more, a sign that his prayer had been heard? His body was still frail, his sickness still present, but there was a flicker of hope in his chest. Could God truly change his mind? Ezekiel had seen miracles before, but never had he needed one more than he did now. With one final breath, Ezekiel whispered, "Lord, if there is mercy left for me, let it be now." His words hung in the air like a final offering, a testament to his faith. The room fell silent once more, and Ezekiel closed his eyes, his body exhausted but his spirit clinging to the hope that God would hear him. Could a king's prayer reach the throne of heaven? He didn't know, but his heart held on to that possibility like a lifeline. Then the door opened. Isaiah entered once more, his face unreadable. Had God answered? Ezekiel's heart pounded in his chest as the prophet approached, every second stretching into eternity. What news did he bring? The moment hung heavy with anticipation, the fate of a king hanging in the balance. 4. The divine response, a miracle of extended life. Isaiah's eyes met Ezekiel's as he entered the room. There was a weight to his presence, a gravity that seemed to pull the air from the room. Had God answered? Ezekiel's heart raced as the prophet approached, his face still unreadable. The tension was unbearable, the silence stretching on as if the universe itself held its breath. Could one prayer truly change the will of God? Ezekiel had cried out in desperation, but now he stood on the edge of the unknown. Finally, Isaiah spoke. "This is what the Lord, the God of your father David says, I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will heal you. On the third day from now you will go up to the temple of the Lord." 2 Kings 20:5. The words fell like rain on parched ground. God had heard him. Ezekiel's heart swelled with hope. The tears that had once been born of despair now flowed with gratitude. Could it be true? Isaiah continued, his voice steady and clear. I will add 15 years to your life, and I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. 2 Kings 20:6. The decree was clear. God had not only extended Ezekiel's life, but had promised to protect Judah. 15 more years. The weight of the miracle settled over Ezekiel like a mantle of grace. How could it be? Ezekiel had stood at the edge of death, his fate sealed by the words of the prophet, but now, in an act of divine mercy, God had reversed the decree. What had changed? Was it his prayer, his tears, or the faith he had clung to in his darkest moment? Ezekiel's mind raced with gratitude and awe. The God of Israel had heard him, and in his infinite mercy had given him more time. As Isaiah spoke, Ezekiel's body trembled with the weight of what had just occurred. Was this truly happening? He had expected death, had prepared for the end, but now he stood on the threshold of a new beginning. 15 more years. What would he do with this time? The gift of life had been given, but it came with a responsibility, a divine mandate to lead Judah through the challenges that lay ahead. The room was filled with a sense of the miraculous. Ezekiel, once a man facing the end, now stood before a future that had been rewritten by the hand of God. How could he ever repay such mercy? His heart overflowed with gratitude, but alongside it came a new resolve. These 15 years were not just a gift, they were a second chance. Could he lead with even greater wisdom, knowing that his life had been spared? Isaiah instructed the servants to prepare a poultice of figs to place on the king's boils, a sign of the healing that was to come. Was this part of the miracle, or simply a symbol of what God had already decreed? Ezekiel watched as they obeyed, feeling the weight of his illness lift with each passing moment. The sickness that had threatened to claim him was retreating, driven away by the power of God's word. Could healing be this simple? As the day passed, Ezekiel felt his strength return. The illness that had once sapped his energy now seemed like a distant memory. 15 more years. The words echoed in his mind like a promise. He had been given a second chance, a new lease on life. But what would he do with it? The miracle was real, but so too was the responsibility that came with it. How would he use these precious years to fulfill the purpose God had extended his life for? With a heart full of gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose, Ezekiel rose from his bed. God had heard him. His prayer had reached the heavens, and in his mercy, the Lord had granted him life. But this life was not his own. It belonged to God, and the king knew that he must use every moment wisely. 15 years. It was more than time. It was a divine calling, and Ezekiel was ready to answer it. 5. The burden of a miracle, living under the weight of extended time. Ezekiel's heart soared with gratitude, but beneath that gratitude, a new burden began to form. 15 years. The weight of those years pressed down on him as he lay in his bed, feeling the strength return to his body. Why had God granted him this gift? It was a question that refused to leave his mind. Every extra day he would live, every decision he made, had to be purposeful. Could he live up to the responsibility of this divine gift? As his body healed, Ezekiel began to reflect on the message Isaiah had delivered. God had promised not only to extend his life, but also to protect Judah. The Assyrians had been a constant threat, their armies looming on the horizon, ready to strike. But now, God himself had pledged to defend the city. Was this divine protection tied to Ezekiel's continued faithfulness? The thought both comforted and troubled him. Could he remain faithful for the entirety of those 15 years? The gift of extended life was not without its challenges. Ezekiel had always been a righteous king, but he knew his weaknesses. What if he failed? What if he squandered these years, letting pride or complacency slip in? The added years felt like a second chance, but also like a test. Was he strong enough to remain humble, to remain focused on God's will? His prayer had saved his life, but now the real test began. How would he use the time given to him? As he rose from his bed, stronger with each passing day, the kingdom of Judah looked to their king with renewed hope. Their king had been saved by a miracle. Surely this was a sign of God's favor on the nation. But Ezekiel knew better. He understood the weight of the responsibility that came with this miracle. 15 years. It was both a blessing and a burden. What if these extra years were not just for him, but for the people? Could his leadership during this time secure Judah's future? The more Ezekiel thought about it, the clearer it became. God had spared him for a purpose. His work was not yet finished. The reforms he had begun, the cleansing of the temple, the restoration of proper worship, were only the beginning. Now, with this extension of life, He had the chance to strengthen Judah, to prepare them for the challenges ahead. But could he rise to the occasion? The thought of failing in this divine assignment weighed heavily on him. In the quiet moments of reflection, Ezekiel also began to think about the personal side of this miracle. How does a man live, knowing exactly how long he has left? Most people live their lives with uncertainty, never knowing when their time will come. But Ezekiel had been given a specific number, 15 years. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. How would he measure time now? Each year, each month, each day would be counted. Would it make him cherish life more, or would it become a burden? As the days passed and his strength returned fully, Ezekiel could feel the weight of the future pressing down on him. He had prayed for more time, and God had granted it. But what if he wasted it? The question gnawed at him. The people looked to him for leadership, for strength, but he knew that the responsibility went beyond mere governance. Could he lead Judah into a future that honored the God who had spared him? The thought consumed him. And so, as Ezekiel stood before the people of Judah once again, fully restored in health, he understood that these next 15 years were not his own. They belonged to God. The miracle that had saved his life had also placed a great burden upon him. A burden to lead, to serve, and to honor the God who had granted him this second chance. But would he be able to fulfill it? 6. The flaws of a king, Ezekiel's pride and mistakes. As the years passed, Ezekiel found himself slipping into a dangerous mindset, one that often comes after divine favor. Pride. The king who had once wept and prayed for his life now stood as a man confident in God's favor. Could pride undo the very blessing God had given him? It began subtly, with small decisions that seemed inconsequential at first. But soon, Ezekiel's confidence in his miraculous extension of life led him down a path of arrogance. One of the greatest signs of this growing pride came when Babylonian envoys arrived in Judah. Ezekiel, eager to show the strength and wealth of his kingdom, welcomed them openly. He proudly showed them his treasuries, the vast wealth of Judah, and the strength of his armies. But was this wise? The king's heart swelled with pride as he displayed the treasures he believed were secured by God's favor. Had he forgotten the humility that had once brought him to his knees in prayer? The moment was subtle, but it was the beginning of a grave mistake. By showing the Babylonians the wealth of Judah, Ezekiel unknowingly planted the seeds for future invasion. The pride that had led him to flaunt his riches would eventually lead to Judah's downfall. Could he not see the danger? What had begun as gratitude for extended life had transformed into a belief that he was untouchable, that the favor of God could not be revoked. But had Ezekiel forgotten that his prayer had been born out of humility, not pride? Isaiah, the prophet who had delivered both the decree of death and the message of life, returned to Ezekiel once more. This time, his message was not one of mercy, but of warning. What did those men see in your palace? Isaiah asked, his tone grave. Ezekiel replied confidently, They saw everything in my palace. There is nothing among my treasures that I did not show them. 2 Kings 20:15. The pride in Ezekiel's voice was unmistakable. Isaiah's response was swift and sobering. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. 2 Kings 20:17. The words struck like a dagger. Could Ezekiel's pride have sealed Judah's future doom? The very kingdom he had prayed to protect was now at risk because of his own arrogance. Was this the legacy of his extra years? Ezekiel's heart sank as Isaiah's words echoed in his mind. Had he truly squandered the divine gift of life? The king who had once begged for more time now faced the reality that his actions during those extra years had led to a grim future for Judah. Could his pride have blinded him to the dangers that surrounded him? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him once more, but this time it felt heavier than ever. The king's pride had led him down a path of complacency. Had he forgotten the lessons of his prayer? The humility that had once defined him seemed distant now. Ezekiel had been given 15 more years, not for his own glory, but for God's purposes. But had he lost sight of that purpose in the process? The question gnawed at him as the consequences of his actions became clearer. Would his reign, extended by divine mercy, end in failure? Ezekiel's heart ached as he realized the full weight of Isaiah's prophecy. The pride that had led him to show off his kingdom's wealth had now put that very kingdom in jeopardy. His extra years, a gift from God, had been tainted by his own arrogance. Could he still redeem the time he had left, or was it too late? The king, once full of hope and gratitude, now found himself facing the consequences of his own flaws. 7. Reflection and repentance, the weight of time. As the years passed, Ezekiel could not escape the weight of his actions. Had he failed to honor the gift God had given him? The prophecy of Isaiah hung over him like a cloud, a constant reminder that the pride of his heart had led him astray. The king who had once prayed for life now found himself wrestling with the burden of that life. Had he used his extended time wisely, or had he squandered it on vanity? Ezekiel's heart was heavy with regret. Could a man, even one as blessed as he, ever truly live up to the mercy of God? He had been granted 15 more years, a chance to lead Judah with wisdom and humility. But now, as those years began to slip away, he found himself reflecting on the mistakes he had made. Had he truly honored God, or had he fallen into the very trap of pride that he had once prayed against? The king spent long hours in prayer, seeking the face of the God who had extended his life. Could he still find mercy? Was there still a chance to redeem the time that remained? Ezekiel's heart ached as he cried out to God, his prayers once again filled with the same desperation that had saved him before. But could repentance now undo the damage that had been done? The question lingered in his mind, heavy and unresolved. As he reflected on the events of the past years, Ezekiel realized that the gift of life was not simply an extension of time, it was a call to greater faithfulness. Had he misunderstood the purpose of those extra years? The king who had once begged for more time now saw that time as both a blessing and a test. Had he failed the test? The question haunted him as he sought to reconcile the man he had become with the man he had prayed to be. Ezekiel's heart grew heavy with the realization that his pride had not only affected him, but also his kingdom. Had his actions placed Judah at risk? The thought was unbearable. The king who had once fought to protect his people now saw that his pride had placed them in jeopardy. Could God still use him, despite his failures? The hope of redemption flickered in his heart, but it was tempered by the weight of his mistakes. In his moments of deepest reflection, Ezekiel found himself returning to the prayer that had saved his life. Could that same prayer save him again, not from death, but from the consequences of his pride? The king's heart was torn between hope and despair, between the knowledge of his mistakes and the possibility of grace. Could a man who had been given so much still find mercy in the eyes of God? The question burned within him. As the 15th year of his extended life approached, Ezekiel knew that his time was drawing to a close. What would be his legacy? The king who had once been granted a miraculous extension of life now stood at the threshold of death once more, but this time with the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Could he face death with peace, knowing that he had done all he could to honor the God who had saved him? With a heart full of both gratitude and regret, Ezekiel turned once again to the God of Israel. Would his prayer for redemption be heard once more? The king knew that time was running out, but the hope of grace still flickered in his heart. Could God's mercy extend even to a man who had stumbled, despite being given a second chance? Only time would tell. 8. The end of the journey, legacy and redemption. As the 15th year approached, Ezekiel's heart grew heavy with the knowledge that his time was almost up. How does a man live, knowing the exact moment of his death? For years, he had lived under the weight of this divine deadline, trying to fulfill the purpose for which God had extended his life. But as the end neared, Ezekiel couldn't escape the lingering regret over his mistakes. Had he done enough to honor the gift of life he had been given? The memories of his reign swirled through his mind. The temple restoration, the reforms, the miraculous healing, but also the missteps, the prideful decisions that had endangered Judah's future. Would his legacy be one of faithfulness or of failure? The question haunted him as the days slipped away, each one a reminder that his life, though extended, was still finite. Had he truly redeemed the time God had granted him? Yet, despite the weight of his regrets, Ezekiel found solace in the fact that he had turned back to God. Could God's grace cover even his mistakes? The king who had once wept bitterly before the Lord now found himself praying once again, not for an extension of life, but for mercy and forgiveness. Could a life redeemed in the final years still leave a lasting legacy of faithfulness? Ezekiel's heart clung to that hope as his final days approached. The people of Judah, unaware of the king's inner turmoil, still looked to him as a leader chosen by God. Would they remember him for his strength or for his failures? Ezekiel wondered how his people would carry on after his death. Would they learn from his pride, or would they repeat the mistakes he had made? The thought weighed heavily on him, but he knew that his time for teaching and leading was drawing to a close. Could his story serve as a warning, a reminder of the dangers of pride, even for those favored by God? In his final days, Ezekiel called his advisors and family together. He spoke to them not as a king, but as a man who had witnessed both the mercy and the judgment of God. Remember, he told them, it is the Lord who holds our lives in his hands. We must walk humbly before him, for even the greatest among us can fall when pride takes hold. His voice trembled as he spoke, but his heart was steady. Could his final words leave an impact that would resonate for generations to come? The day finally arrived when Ezekiel knew his time had come. He had prayed for more years, and God had answered with 15. Now, standing at the threshold of death once again, the king felt a sense of peace that he had not known before. Could a man who had been given a second chance leave this world with the assurance of redemption? Ezekiel's heart was filled with gratitude for the life he had lived, the lessons he had learned, and the God who had shown him mercy. As Ezekiel lay on his deathbed, surrounded by those who loved him, he reflected one last time on the journey that had brought him here. 15 years. The gift of life had come with a heavy burden, but it had also come with profound lessons. What would he be remembered for? The question no longer frightened him. Ezekiel had made mistakes, but he had also sought forgiveness. He had stumbled, but he had risen again in faith. Could that be his legacy, one of redemption, not perfection? With a final breath, Ezekiel whispered a prayer to the God who had extended his life, asking for mercy, not just for himself, but for the people of Judah. Could God's grace extend beyond him, to protect the kingdom even after he was gone? His eyes closed for the last time, and Ezekiel passed into eternity, not with fear, but with the peace of a man who had found redemption in the arms of a merciful God. His journey had come full circle, from the brink of death to life to redemption. 9. Final reflection, a legacy of redemption. Ezekiel's story is one of both human frailty and divine mercy. How often do we too find ourselves standing at the crossroads of pride and humility, of faith and fear? Ezekiel's prayer moved the heart of God, changing the course of his life, but it was what he did with those extra years that ultimately shaped his legacy. Could we, like him, learn to live with the responsibility of the time we are given? His 15 years of extended life were a second chance, but they were also a test of his character. In those years, he experienced both the highs of divine favor and the lows of personal failure. What do we do when we are given a second chance? Do we embrace it with humility, or do we let pride lead us astray? Ezekiel's story reminds us that even the most faithful among us can falter, but redemption is always within reach if we turn back to God. In the end, Ezekiel's legacy was not one of perfection, but of repentance and redemption. Could that be the truest measure of a life well lived? Not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to seek forgiveness, to learn, and to grow. Ezekiel's story challenges us to reflect on our own lives. How are we using the time that God has given us? Are we walking humbly before him, or are we letting pride lead us down a dangerous path? As we reflect on Ezekiel's journey, we are reminded that the God who extended his life is the same God who extends mercy to us each day. What will we do with the time we have been given? The choices we make today will shape the legacy we leave behind tomorrow. Ezekiel's story calls us to live with purpose, with humility, and with a heart that is always turned toward God. Could we too find redemption in the time we have left? Ezekiel's story reminds us of the preciousness of time and the responsibility that comes with it. What are you doing with the time God has given you? Are you living with purpose, or are you letting pride and distractions lead you away from your true calling? Reflect on the choices you're making today, and remember that it's never too late to turn back to God and seek his guidance. How do you think Ezekiel's story applies to your own life? What would you do with 15 extra years? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and encourage your faith. Let's continue this journey together. How are you using the time you've been given? Let us know in the comments below.